HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Beautiful Country and the Middle Kingdom, America and China, 1776 to the Present, by John Pomfret. Read by Tom Perkins. Prologue. On a barren subarctic landmass 9,000 miles from his native Boston, William Dane Phelps stalked his prey. A colony of elephant seals lazed on a narrow beach, safe from the sharks and orcas that fed on them in the open sea. But here came Phelps, a teenager with a spear. 10 people were waiting to eat, and Phelps had been commanded to cook. The only problem, the meat, all 1,900 pounds of it, was alive. "I was left alone to get breakfast," Phelps recalled. "I knew nothing of the habits of the elephant, had never seen one killed, and there I was." Phelps picked what looked to be the most docile of the beasts and leapt into battle. He struck the seal on the nose. The animal reared up on its flippers, bellowing as it towered over the boy. That opened up the monster's midsection. Phelps tried to plunge in his spear, but the animal caught the weapon in its mouth and gave it a jerk, cracking Phelps on the head and knocking him on his back. Phelps righted himself, bashed out the creature's eyes with his club, and, he wrote, lanced him until he was dead. It was 1817, and 15-year-old Phelps was a 6-month sail from home, having just landed on Marion Island, a speck of land 1,000 miles from the southernmost tip of Africa. Phelps was one of a crew of 25 aboard the Pickering, a brig from Boston that was scouring the seas for fur seals. They had struck pay dirt on Marion. While their ship went off in search of more treasure, Phelps and 7 others remained on the wind-swept isle to hunt and skin. Phelps and his shipmates spent almost 2 years on Marion, living in a cave and clothing themselves in animal skins as they killed thousands of fur seals and amassed tons of elephant seal oil. But the men's bounty was not destined for the coats, mufflers, and night lamps of the moneyed families of Beacon Hill and Back Bay. When the Pickering returned for the hunters, it whisked them off not to New England, but to Canton, China. In the early 19th century, the promise of the China market sent Americans journeying around the world, killing and harvesting in staggering numbers. 6 million fur seals, the pelts of 250,000 sea otters, tons of sea cucumber and ginseng, forests of sandalwood, millions of silver dollars, all destined for China. Phelps and hundreds of other Americans spun the first threads of an enormous tapestry that they and their Chinese friends, competitors, customers, lovers, and enemies would weave into a story of wild exploits, extreme misjudgments, and unsung impact. Many Americans believe that their country's ties to China began when Richard Nixon traveled there in 1972, ending the Cold War between the two nations. In fact, the two sides have been interacting with and influencing each other since the founding of the United States. It wasn't just free land that lured American settlers westward. It was also the dream of selling to China. The idea of America also inspired the Chinese, pulling them toward modernity and the outside world. American science, educational theory, and technology flowed into China. Chinese art, food, and philosophy flowed out. Since then, thread by thread, the two peoples and their various governments have crafted the most multifaceted and today the most important relationship between any two nations in the world. Now is the time to retell the story of the United States and China. Today, these two nations face each other, not quite friends, not yet enemies, pursuing parallel quests for power while the world watches. No problem of worldwide concern, from global warming to terrorism to the proliferation of nuclear weapons to the economy, can be solved unless Washington and Beijing find a way to work together. America's first fortunes were made in the China trade from 1783 until the early 1800s, and profits from that commerce bankrolled America's Industrial Revolution. In the 1830s, the 40-odd Americans living in the tiny trade outpost on the outskirts of Canton boxed far above their weight. Thanks to their labors, the United States became the Middle Kingdom's number 2 trading partner after the mighty British. Chinese officials then began what would become a tradition, looking at the United States as a bulwark against China's enemies. Over the years, they would propose alliances with the United States to counter the British, the Germans, the Russians or Soviets, and the Japanese. The first American Christian missionaries arrived in China in the 1830s. Though they are often held up as an unbecoming example of American cultural imperialism, forcing Jesus on an unwilling people steeped in an older Confucian creed, they were crucial to China's development. Along with Western-educated Chinese, they supplied the tools to break the stranglehold of traditional orthodoxy. They taught the Chinese Western science, critical thinking, sports, industry, and law. They established China's first universities and hospitals. These institutions, though now renamed, are still the best of their kind in China. America's women missionaries crusaded against the barbaric customs of female infanticide and foot binding, helping to accomplish the greatest human rights advances in modern Chinese history. As Americans brought Christianity to China, laborers from southern China flocked to California in search of gold. By the 1860s, they constituted the largest population of foreign-born people in the American West. Those who didn't pan for gold wound up building the West. They drained the Sacramento River Delta, creating one of the richest agricultural belts in history. They laid half of the transcontinental railroad connecting the east and west coasts. With their grocery stores, laundries, vegetable patches, and apothecaries stocked with herbal remedies, they provided essential services without which the West could not have been won. Mainstream Americans turned on the Chinese in the 1870s. Congress made them the first ethnic group to be banned from the United States when it blocked Chinese workers from America in 1882. The Chinese did not stop coming, however, and using funds collected by Chinese merchants, they hired America's best lawyers to challenge a raft of racist laws and ordinances. Those cases contributed greatly to the advancement of civil rights for all Americans, undergirding, for example, the push in the 1950s to dismantle the separate but equal educational system for American blacks. Despite its racism, America remained a land where many Chinese could realize their dreams. The Chinese were hounded across the West, not simply because they were different. In their industriousness, they rivaled and threatened competing white settlers, and they made whites work harder. That ability to thrive in America and make all of America more competitive continues to this day. While some Americans hated the Chinese, others nurtured a deep concern with China's well-being. Though commercial activity dominated the U.S. approach to Europe, South America, Japan, and elsewhere, the emotional attachment to these places, with the exception of Great Britain, was not nearly so deep as that to China. "Clear your plate, there are children starving in China," was a dinner-table mantra for generations of Americans. So was the Pennies for China campaign in churches across the heartland. With the turn of the 20th century and the dawning of America as a global power, policymakers in Washington took more interest in China and fought to keep the country whole, despite efforts by European nations and Japan to carve it into colonies. American statesmen moved to bind China's best and brightest to the United States, establishing a fund to educate Chinese stateside. The Boxer Indemnity Scholarship spawned Nobel Prize winners, scientists, politicians, engineers, and writers, and set the scene for a Chinese intellectual renaissance in the 1920s and 1930s. Those same decades found Americans intrigued by Chinese culture, its food, art, poetry, and mysticism. A Chinese-American woman from Los Angeles became the first non-white movie star in the United States. American taste buds accepted Chinese food. American tycoons put together the world's greatest collections of Chinese art and endowed museums from Boston to New York, Washington, Kansas City, and San Francisco to house them. In 1937, the Japanese invasion of China knit China and America closer together than ever. Before the war, there had been 10,000 Americans in China. Their numbers jumped tenfold in just a few years. But as the war progressed, America came to see its Chinese ally, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, as dictatorial, incompetent, and, worst of all, unwilling to fight Japan. As a result, many Americans viewed Chiang's enemies, the Chinese Communist Party, as the true guerrilla David battling a mechanized Japanese Goliath. State Department officials were convinced of the accuracy of this perspective and steered U.S. policy away from providing aid to Chiang for his showdown with the Communists after the war. We now know that the reality was more complex. Chiang's armies fought so stalwartly that it was they, not the Communists, who sustained 90% of the casualties battling the Japanese. Americans at the time comforted themselves with the notion that the United States had done all it could to help Chiang Kai-shek, but countless promises of aid, weapons, and gold to his government had gone unfulfilled. Some historians have argued that after the war, the United States missed a chance to forge good relations with Chairman Mao Zedong as communism took hold. But documents from Chinese archives released in recent years show that Mao was not ready for ties with America. Mao used hatred of the U.S. as an ideological pillar of his revolution. Even today, the legacy of Mao's paranoia about America colors China's relationships with the United States. In the 1970s, Western obituaries reporting the demise of American influence in China were premature. Almost from the day China reopened to the West, American pragmatism, its free market approach, and light-touch regulation have dominated China's economic reforms. American culture has monopolized its movie and TV screens, and Christianity, despite communist oppression, has experienced a renaissance of unprecedented proportions. American values, education, and even its fresh air are the envy of many Chinese. From Deng Xiaoping on, every communist leader has sent at least one of his children to the U.S. to study, including the Harvard-educated daughter of the current president, Xi Jinping. When the two nations rediscovered each other in the 1970s, American sympathetic regard for the Middle Kingdom was rekindled, and Americans again worked to make China strong. Since then, no other country has been more important to China's rise than the United States. Its open markets, open universities, and open society have served as the key foreign drivers of China's return to greatness. Meanwhile, China has renewed its claim on the American imagination and entered every home with the ubiquitous three-word phrase, "Made in China." For those listening to this book in China, the time is also right for a reappraisal of the Middle Kingdom's ties to Meiguo, the beautiful country, China's name for the United States. Communist histories have twisted the story of America's 200-year-long association with China. In the early days of the relationship, Chinese are told, the United States schemed to colonize China, acting no better than the imperialist powers of old Europe or even Japan. They're taught that American charity was a trick. The Chinese version of World War II airbrushes American sacrifices from the tale. China, not the United States, beat Japan, the Chinese learn. As for the Korean War, to this day Chinese textbooks maintain that South Korea, backed by America, started that conflagration, when in truth it was the North Koreans supported by Joseph Stalin and Mao. Over the past 5 decades, these same textbooks also claim America has sought to keep China down. Still, although the Communist Party won't admit it publicly, many Chinese privately acknowledge America's role in China's ascent and the fact that, more than perhaps any other nation, China has benefited from the Pax Americana, the system of free trade, secure waterways, and globalized financial markets built by the United States and its allies after World War II. It is no coincidence that although China's growth was impressive in the 1980s and 1990s, it became a global trading power only after 2001, when the United States ushered it into the World Trade Organization. As the imprisoned Nobel Peace Prize laureate Liu Xiaobo observed, China needs challenge, even menace from another civilization. It needs a vast and surging, boundless sea to pound it out of its isolation, its solitude, and its narrow-mindedness. America has filled that role. Year by year, decade by decade, the two nations have bound themselves closer together. America has been China's top trading partner since the 1990s. China surpassed Canada to become America's top partner in 2015. Scientists on both sides of the Pacific cooperate in more fields: fighting cancer, splitting genes, looking for clean energy, investigating atomic particles, discovering new drugs, than their counterparts in any other two countries. Complications between these two great nations abound as the United States and China and Americans and Chinese cooperate and compete across the world. If there is a pattern to this baffling complexity, it may be best described as a never-ending Buddhist cycle of reincarnation. Both sides experience rapturous enchantment begetting hope, followed by disappointment, repulsion, and disgust, only to return to fascination once again. In the 19th and 20th centuries, American missionaries fantasized that China would become the world's largest Christian nation, while mandarins in Beijing counted on America to shield their country from the depredations of European imperialists and Japan. Neither wish was fulfilled, but new expectations follow inevitable disillusion with every spin of history's wheel. At present, Americans have entered the disenchantment phase of the cycle, their views clouded by economic and strategic concerns. China, the narrative goes, pilfers American jobs, swipes its secrets, stockpiles its debt, and is now scheming to expel the U.S. Navy from the Western Pacific. In the American imagination, China has traversed the arc from object of benevolence to fount of anxiety. A trip to the Great Wall, the Forbidden City, and the tomb of the first emperor once topped the bucket list of generations of Americans. Today, U.S. tourist visits to China are flat, and public opinion toward the country has soured. The Chinese feel dispirited, too. Their leaders expected America to make way for China in the Pacific. In the 1970s, senior American officials assured them that the U.S. would pull its troops from South Korea and step aside as China recovered Taiwan, thereby completing China's unification. Many Chinese have also grown tired of Americans telling them what to do. At the same time, other Chinese understand that they are losing the goodwill of many Americans, and this has given them pause. While Americans are asking whether they have given China too much, some Chinese are beginning to ask whether they have pushed America too far. These fluctuations, too, are rooted in history. The two nations have feuded fiercely and frequently, yet irresistibly and inevitably they are drawn back to one another. The result is two powers locked in an entangling embrace that neither can quit. William Dane Phelps would graduate from deckhand to captain and make a handsome living killing sea mammals and selling their hides and oil to the Chinese. Generations of Americans and Chinese followed in his wake, weaving together two vastly different cultures. Through all the whipsaw cycles of boom and bust, dashed hopes and exalted dreams, rivers of blood and mountains of trade, the relationship between the United States and China is powered by love and hate, contempt and respect, fear and awe, generosity and greed. Chinese and Americans arouse deeply conflicted feelings in one another, yet no other two nations' mutual dependence is as vital to the fate of the world as the one between these two great powers. In search of wiser choices for the future, we look to a story that began 3 centuries ago in the founding of a young nation and the death knell of an old one. Part 1. Chapter 1. A New Frontier. The year was 1776, and the American colonies were seized with revolutionary fervor. But in New Hampshire, a 25-year-old student studying to be a missionary dropped out of Dartmouth College and shipped out with the Royal Navy on Captain James Cook's third and final voyage. 6 years later, after Cook was killed in Hawaii, the sailor, John Ledyard, returned to America's shores to proselytize not for God, but for trade with China. John Ledyard was fired up by a scheme to dispatch Yankee ships around the tip of South America to the Pacific Northwest to collect the pelts of the Northwest sea otter for the China market. Coastal Indians would barter a pelt for only a hatchet or a saw, Ledyard wrote. But the Chinese would pay 100 Mexican silver dollars for a single fur, a markup that his contemporary Adam Smith could love. A Connecticut Yankee with a hooked nose, an ample inheritance, and a penchant for trouble, Ledyard was an American visionary in a time of global turmoil. The Spanish and Portuguese empires were crumbling, the Royal Navy ruled the seas, and America's War of Independence had left the United States barely united and deeply in debt. Britain had shut Yankee merchants out of the lucrative trade with the British West Indies. America's once thriving shipping industry limped along. Its whaling and cod businesses were in tatters. Its slave trade fared little better. "The town of Boston is really poor," complained the Reverend John Eliot in a letter to a friend in March 1780. "If some brighter prospects do not open up, it is my opinion that we cannot subsist." Americans needed a new frontier beyond Europe's sway, and it was to China that they turned, planting deep within the Yankee imagination the fancy that China's markets held the answer to American prayers. In May 1783, Ledyard chased down Robert Morris, the Philadelphia merchant and signer of the Declaration of Independence who had bankrolled the American Revolution. After sharing his China plan with Morris, Ledyard boasted that he would soon be at the helm of the greatest commercial enterprise that has ever been embarked on in this country. But Morris and his partners dawdled, and the impatient Ledyard left the United States again. Urged on by Thomas Jefferson, he tried to cross Russia's vast expanse to reach America's west coast. But the Russians stopped him. His next venture led him to Africa, but as he began his journey into the continent in January 1789, he accidentally poisoned himself and died. Robert Morris stuck with the China idea, however, and on a wintry Sunday, February 22, 1784, the Empress of China, a three-masted ship of 360 tons, set sail from New York harbor bound for the prosperous southern Chinese port of Guangzhou, known to Westerners as Canton. The Empress carried a crew of 42, a box of beaver skins, 12 casks of spirits, and 20,000 Mexican silver dollars. But her prize cargo was 30 tons of American ginseng harvested in the Appalachian forests. Philip Freneau, the poet of the American Revolution, celebrated the ship's departure with verse reflecting America's newly won liberation. The Empress was heading, he wrote, "where George, the British king, forbade Americans to sail before." At noon on May 11, 1785, the Empress returned to New York to a 13-gun salute, one for each of the United States. In her hold she carried more than 25,000 pounds of tea, a load of cloth, and a large selection of porcelain. The venture earned a 30% profit of more than $30,000, nearly $1 million today. The New York News-Dispatch declared that the journey presages a future happy period of trade with China, an example of the high bar that America's fledgling media were already setting for relations with the Middle Kingdom. Morris backed a second voyage, the Pallas, which made $50,000, but his luck soon soured. Pouring his earnings into a Pennsylvania land deal that went belly up, he was tossed into a debtor's prison. Nonetheless, in the next 15 years, more than 200 American ships would follow the Empress to Guangzhou, a fleet second only to the 400 vessels of the British. Tea, which predated coffee as the American beverage of choice, brought American traders to China. The tea that was tossed into Boston harbor on the night of December 16, 1773, had been shipped out of the southern Chinese city of Xiamen. Within a few years of independence, tea composed 9/10 of the goods leaving China on American ships. In 1785, American vessels carried less than 1,000,000 pounds of tea from China. In 1840, they moved 19 million. What began as an exchange of American raw materials for Chinese tea soon mushroomed as Asian handicrafts of every variety flooded into the United States. Though today we speak of an American pivot to Asia, American tastes have been pivoting to Asia for more than 200 years. The American appetite for blue and white Chinese bowls, plates, and teacups was so prodigious that New England carracks limped into Boston harbor with crates suspended over their sides. To a people who only recently had measured wealth by the number of chairs a household owned, Chinese porcelain, known as china, represented status and taste. China in 1800 was a manufacturing powerhouse responsible for about 1/3 of all the goods made in the world, and Americans were beguiled by its products. Willow pattern porcelain, inscribed with trees, bridges, and pagodas, monks and scholars, filled us with wonder and delight, or haunted us in dreams at night, wrote poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Boston's upper crust clothed themselves in Chinese silk. The dining room in George Washington's Mount Vernon boasted a 302-piece dinner and tea set brought to America by the Empress of China. Chinese porcelain sparked the founding of an American porcelain industry. Curtains from China inspired the American drapery business. As there is today, there was fakery on all sides. Chinese artists churned out some 200 copies of Gilbert Stuart's famed portrait of George Washington. Yankee merchants sold them in Philadelphia until Stuart won a court order in 1802 banning their sale. American woodworkers paired pagodas with Algonquin longhouses on Yankee-made side tables made to look Chinese. In Boston and New York, tea salesmen packaged old Chinese tea in new boxes. The entrepreneurial gumption would only be matched 2 centuries later when Chinese knockoff artists produced vast quantities of bogus North Face jackets and pirated DVDs. American fascination with things Chinese went beyond household goods and luxury items. In 1834, 2 New York businessmen brought a Chinese woman named Afong Moy to the city, where they displayed her in a cage. Dressed in Oriental finery, Moy was part of an exhibition to sell Chinese knickknacks. The New York press went wild, extolling her bound feet and exotic ways. When she arrived in New York harbor in October, the advertised price to see her was a quarter. By the time she opened at 8 Park Place a few weeks later, it was up to 50 cents. Moy's success inspired American showman P.T. Barnum to devote a whole museum to the Chinese, as freaks. Among his showpieces was a pair of conjoined twins. Fused at their rib cages, Chung and Ung Bunker were shipped to the United States in 1829 by Robert Hunter, a British merchant, who believed that he'd struck it rich with a touring exhibition of Chinese mutants. Though they were ethnic Chinese, the pair hailed from Siam, hence the term Siamese twins. After 3 years in America, Chung and Ung successfully sued Hunter for breach of contract and set out on their own. Chung and Ung's case was not the first time Chinese had turned to America's courts for justice. That tradition dates back at least to 1805, when Chinese merchants began filing motions against their deadbeat American counterparts in Philadelphia's courts. Even then, Chinese plaintiffs were impressed with what one petitioner called America's equal protection of the rich and of the poor, and for dealing equal measure to its own citizen and to the alien. Many more cases would follow. Acting as their own managers, Chung and Ung toured the young nation, appearing in formal wear, performing backflips and somersaults, and hoisting portly spectators on their heads. With their earnings, the twins purchased a 100-acre plantation with slaves in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. They married sisters, Sarah and Adelaide Yates, and fathered 21 children. They died in 1874 within...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?